share my video. I can say good evening now, as it's almost 7 p.m. Our last speaker today is Scott Hodge. I had a pleasure to meet Scott at the European Resource Bank event in Prague in early April this year. And we had a nice conversation, and I mentioned him that we are organizing this pretty big worldwide libertarian event called Liberty International World Summit. And Scott, as you know from the biography, he is head of the Tax Foundation. But don't be mistaken by the name. They don't like taxes. They advocate something opposite. Yeah. And we talked a little bit. He told me about his history. He's really, for a long time, advocate for freedom. It dates back to the times when he co-founded the Free Market Institute in Chicago. Heartland?
The Heartland Institute.
The Heartland Institute in Chicago. Who knows Heartland Institute in Chicago?
Yeah.
A big number of people. So this man, he started Heartland Institute, and today he's with Tax Foundation, fighting against over-taxation, not only in the United States, but also right now is a global challenge. Yeah. And he's doing amazing work. So I will not take more of his time, and I'm giving the microphone to Scott.
Thank you. You know, there are two really difficult times to have a speaking role at a conference. One is right after lunch when people are full and sleepy, and the other time is right before dinner when people are hungry and have an appointment in an hour for dinner. So it's my challenge. My friend over here said, well, you better be entertaining because you're standing between me and dinner. Well, let me start out with, I'll sober you up a little bit. I think that's my goal here before things get out of hand today. Let me show you a little video since I had some video envy after watching some of them today. I thought I'd show you this one to kind of set the stage for what I'll be talking about today. Hopefully the volume will be up too. Yeah, that video makes my blood boil. I've been in this movement for over 35 years, as Jacek mentioned, and I know how hard it is to sell free market ideas to people who are wedded to government. But there's nothing like stepping behind enemy lines to give you a real appreciation for how difficult it is to sell our free market ideas, and especially free market tax policy. Last year I was invited to Brussels by the European Commission to speak at a conference. The conference was on the issue of tax fairness. And I was asked to appear on a panel on the question of who pays the corporate income tax? Is it corporations or individuals? Now, for everybody in this room, that's a pretty dumb question, isn't it? Corporations don't pay taxes, people do. And so when I started out my remarks by saying corporations no more pay taxes than a pack of cigarettes pays the tobacco tax, I heard a gasp in the room. My remarks weren't taken all that well as I tried to sell as best as I could the notion that it's people ultimately that pay taxes. It's people ultimately who bear the economic burden of taxation. But this conference was something different. It was really a love fest, to be honest with you, between members of the European Commission and members of Oxfam and Tax Justice Network and other big left-wing NGOs. And their whole mission of this conference and a series of conferences that they've been holding is to really broaden their broader agenda about reducing tax competition between countries, force corporations and high net wealth individuals to pay their fair share of taxation, really as a means of raising more revenues to fund the welfare state and to support redistribution. And if you think I'm exaggerating, here's how Pierre Moscovici, who's the EU Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs, started the conference. Here are his opening remarks. He said, "Social justice is an EU priority. There is no contradiction between growth, fairness, and social justice." He went on to say that progressive taxation is necessary to support a fairer society and social cohesion. In his mind, the welfare state is the key to social cohesion. I guess there's unity when everybody's on the dole. I mean, is that what it is? And a couple of the panelists were actually pretty honest in admitting that their tax fairness campaign was really about extracting more resources to fund their liberal agenda, left-wing agenda, excuse me. In fact, one of the women who works for a NGO that does development was very honest when she said, the money that we need to solve poverty is out of our reach because of tax avoidance. So that is why we need these global efforts to make multinationals pay their fair share of tax. Environmental groups, she said, are now joining the anti-tax avoidance effort because they too are tired of hearing that there is no money to address environmental issues. Oh. The head of Oxfam Ireland was equally honest. He said Oxfam does not have an anti-wealthy agenda. No, they have an anti-poverty agenda. He says that the estimated $100 billion a year lost in taxes to governments globally was due to tax evasion is more than all the economic development aid given to poor countries. And that women and children are victims of this tax avoidance because those lost tax collections could not be used for healthcare, education, and the development for poor and developing countries. And it was at that moment that I decided the Tax Foundation needs to be involved in global tax policy. And this year we launched our brand new global tax reform project in response to the redistribution of tax policies that are being promoted not only by Oxfam and Tax Justice Network, but the European Commission, International Monetary Fund, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and believe it or not, the World Health Organization. As I witnessed in this video and this conference, these large institutions, international bodies, are working symbiotically with these groups. In fact, the European Commission subsidizes, gives grants to Oxfam and others, and trains them to go out and agitate against tax avoidance. And it's really all about trying to raise more revenue for their agenda. In fact, this summer the Commission sponsored a series of conferences across Europe on the issue of tax fairness. They wanted to keep that notion alive. The IMF just held a conference in Washington, D.C. called Splitting the Riches, which debated a new way of apportioning corporate profits and taxes around the globe. The World Health Organization has been working with billionaire Michael Bloomberg to encourage countries to tax soda and snacks under the guise of discouraging and addressing obesity. And our global tax reform program has two goals. The first, we got to push back on this fair share notion with hard facts and sound economic principles. Second, we want to work with our allies like you in Europe to push pro-growth tax reform country by country. Because I believe that the more that we foster tax competition between countries here in Europe, the more we can prove to folks here that tax reform and sound tax policy is in their self-interest, but it also separates them from the agenda of the European Commission and Oxfam and so forth. What left-wing groups see as tax avoidance, we see simply as tax competition between countries. And what they fear most is what's called a race to the bottom, especially in corporate taxation, where countries keep cutting their corporate tax rates. And I say if they fear it, we should give it to them, right? So let me spend a few minutes kind of giving you a sense and a picture of what their agenda is all about and some of the ways that we're kind of pushing back on it. And in each of their own ways, whether it's the tax fairness agenda or even simple things like soda taxes, all strike at the heart of freedom, free enterprise, and actually free countries as well. This happens to be the 10th anniversary of one of the more important studies in tax policy. And believe it or not, it was done by economists at the OECD in Paris. And it was a simple study called Tax and Economic Growth. And they set out to determine which taxes were most harmful for economic growth. And they studied all the literature, they did their own research, and they developed a simple hierarchy, a really important simple hierarchy for which taxes impacted growth the most. And it was really based on the mobility of the factor in the economy. They figured that the most mobile factors in the economy were most sensitive to economic growth, and thus high taxes on those factors had the biggest impact on economic growth. And what they determined was that the corporate income tax is the most harmful tax for economic growth. Why? Because capital is the most mobile factor in the economy and thus the most sensitive to high tax policies and high tax rates, and can easily move between countries, sometimes at the press of a button. The next most harmful tax for growth were personal income taxes, followed by consumption taxes such as the VAT, followed by property taxes. And naturally, property taxes are pretty immune to taxes, or property itself, because it's pretty immobile. Now, there are a couple of interesting ironies here about the corporate tax. One is the outsized impact of corporate income taxes on economic growth, considering how little governments actually raise from the corporate income tax. The typical OECD nation, developed nation, collects only about 9% of their total revenues in corporate income taxes, about 3% of GDP, more or less, and yet it has this outsized impact on economic growth. But as many of you entrepreneurs may know, corporations do pay more than just the corporate income tax. They pay property taxes, they pay taxes on the wages on their workers, etc. And so actually, when you start to look at it, corporations are really the tax collectors for government. In fact, a new OECD study just looked into that, looking at all the taxes that businesses both pay and then collect and remit on our behalf. And one of the things they found is that for the typical developed country, businesses pay about 33%, 1/3 of all the taxes that most governments collect, when you add up their corporate income taxes, their property taxes, and the taxes on their workers. What's also interesting is that they are big tax collectors for us. How many of you paid a value-added tax? Yeah, well, that's actually collected by business. How many of you have wage taxes, like a social insurance taxes? Those too are collected by your employer and remitted to government. So when you add up all the taxes that these companies now pay either on their own or collect on your behalf, in most governments they are responsible for paying between 80 and 90% of all the taxes collected by government. And yet there are some on the left who say that businesses don't pay their fair share of tax. You know, the last couple of decades have been really remarkable in tax policy. There have really been two competing and parallel trends in tax policy across the globe. On the one hand, you've had tremendous competition between countries as country after country has cut its corporate tax rate and created other sort of tax incentives in order to lure capital and jobs and income and ultimately taxes from other countries that aren't as competitive. And it's really especially true for small and developing countries who have used low taxes, low tax rates, as a wedge, as a tool to compete against the behemoths like France and Germany and the United States. And then, of course, the other parallel trend that we've had across the globe is the fact that these big lumbering countries like France, Germany, and the United States have been trying to put up all kinds of barriers to prevent the tax competition that they fear is going to take their tax base away and see it migrate to those more competitive countries. And so they've been conspiring, they being the US, Germany, France, etc., have been conspiring to minimize tax competition under the guise of reducing harmful tax practices, reducing tax avoidance, closing down tax havens, all kinds of euphemisms like that. And they want to make this sound like they're targets of the Cayman Islands or the Isle of Man, when really their targets are Ireland, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Hong Kong, other small countries who are using low taxes to lure capital and investment away from those high tax nations. So at the urging of the G20 governments, the OECD launched a project a few years ago to write new rules to prevent what they called base erosion and profit shifting, or BEPS for short. And the goal of the BEPS project is to get every country to agree to these new sets of tax rules to limit the tax planning abilities of companies. And more than 100 countries have now signed up for these rules. So, when you think about it, how much is at stake here in this global effort to chase down the last euro, the last dollar of corporate income that's supposedly being avoided and paying their fair share? Well, you'll find out it's not as much as it seems. Estimates of corporate tax avoidance are kind of all over the map. Oxfam uses the most extreme estimates of $100 to $200 billion a year lost by all governments to tax avoidance. But the European Commission claims that EU countries are losing between 50 and 70 billion euro a year to what they call tax fraud, evasion, and avoidance. That's kind of fuzzy terms there. That covers a lot of ground. Well, 50 to 70 billion euro sounds like a lot of money, except when you compare it to how much European countries actually collect every year in taxes, which last year was 5.8 trillion euro. So 50 to 70 billion euro in lost taxes due to, quote, tax avoidance is really, what, 1% of total tax collections? So a penny on the euro lost in tax avoidance is enough to start these global efforts against tax avoidance. It seems to me that there's more here than what they're saying. And so the question is, given the economic harm that corporate taxation has, you have to wonder how much are these global governments, especially the European Commission, willing to threaten economic growth, willing to increase the tax liability or the compliance burden on taxpayers just to get those last euro of dollars. And it really, to me, it appears that they have not learned about the law of diminishing marginal returns. Now, the European Commission has two initiatives that should worry everyone in this room. The first is this geeky term called the Common Consolidated Corporate Tax Base, or if you're on Twitter, it's CCCTB, or hashtag CCTB. And their idea here is that if all the European countries harmonize their tax base, that's going to reduce the incentives for companies to move capital and taxes between countries and get rid of that pesky tax competition. Well, what this is an attempt by the Frances and the Germanys to take away the sovereignty on tax policy from the rest of the European nations. This is a threat both to the sovereignty, I think, of European countries, but also to their ability to make themselves more competitive in a highly competitive global environment. The second initiative is to create special new taxes aimed only at digital companies. Yeah, for nearly 100 years, the global tax community has generally agreed that companies should pay only income taxes where they have a physical presence. It's based on the principle, and that means boots on the ground, a factory, an office building, or something like that. And it's based on the principle that taxes should be paid where government services are returned or earned. But the growth in the digital economy is kind of turning this notion on its head. Because what you can have is a digital company that's based in Silicon Valley, it's based in Ireland, it's based in Estonia, all doing business with customers in Krakow, Poland, without having any boots on the ground with any physical facilities in that location. And that's driving the bureaucrats in Brussels mad. And that's driving the tax collectors in a lot of countries mad. Because they want a piece of those profits that are being booked and actually paid taxes on in Silicon Valley, in Ireland, Estonia, or whatever. This is really all about revenues. The European Commission has decided it's not going to wait for a global solution on how to tax the digital economy. It's put forward a big report, came out earlier this year, recommending a number of solutions that they want their fellows in the European Union to adopt in order to deal with this problem of digital taxation. And it starts by really creating a new standard for taxing companies. Now, instead of taxing companies based on where they're located, the Commission says that we're going to tax them based on where the value is created. This is sort of a metaphysical debate, I think. And since digital companies don't have a physical place or presence in a country, the Commission says that value is created when you and I interact with that platform. You see, their theory is really based on this notion that when I post my funny cat photos on Facebook, that's creating value for Facebook. They're getting data from my silly cat photos, which they then monetize and sell and earn profits on. And so that interaction is enough to create economic presence in the country, and therefore your country has a right to tax that company that's located somewhere else. Similarly, if I go use Google to search for cats riding bicycles, that creates value for Google in that they get data from that and then they sell it and then they get profits on it that the European Union says my country deserves to tax that. Now, their short-term solution is to tax digital companies, especially the big ones, and they've set a floor of around 500 million euro in sales, and so it's really only getting at the big guys. And the tax is about 3% of total sales or turnover. And it's estimated this raise about 5 billion euro a year, which is not very much when you think about it, about 0.1%. So you think this is what European countries are losing to the digital economy is 0.1% of euro? but I think this is really a camel's nose under the tent. It's a way to get the tax rate started, start at a low amount, it gets jacked up over time, and eventually they're raising real revenues. Now, fortunately, many of your smaller brethren and neighbors, especially those in the Nordic states, have actually issued some challenges to this. They wrote a letter to the European Commission not long ago. This is the finance ministers of Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. And they question these policies. They say these are major departures from established norms of international taxation. So the norm, they remind the European Commission, is that businesses have always been taxed on their net profits. That is, total profits minus expenses equals net profits. That's why we call it a net income tax. But what the European Commission is proposing is a gross receipts tax or a turnover tax on your total sales, irrespective of whether the company is profitable or not. And then they remind the Commission that virtually every company right now is digital and in some way has digital services. You cannot segregate, you can't separate digital from the rest of the economy without hurting innovation and the economy overall. And then they question this silly notion that value creation is deemed to take place when I interact with some sort of a digital platform. As a friend of mine says, under the Commission's theory, all the value creation of French wine is generated when I open the bottle and pour it in my glass and take a sip. And no value creation is actually created by those poor bastards who have to pick the grapes, stomp on the grapes, put them in a bottle, and store them in oak barrels. And lastly, one of the unfair aspects of these sort of tax policies is that digital companies often have no idea where their customers are at any one time. And so you're taxing them based on supposedly where their customers are, and they have no idea. Now there's one, I think, silver lining in all of this that should give us hope. I think a wedge issue here is the fact the United States has now reformed its own tax code, especially the corporate tax code. Up until last year, the United States had the highest corporate tax rate in the industrialized world at 35%. And we just lowered our corporate tax rate now to 21%, making us one of the more competitive countries anywhere. The last time that the United States cut its corporate tax rate was 1986. And that started a wave of tax competition that's continuing today. We think that the U.S. tax reform of last year will hopefully spark a new wave of tax competition across the globe. In fact, the IMF just released a report on the impact of the U.S. corporate tax rate, and it estimates that billions of dollars worth of capital and tax revenues are now going to start flowing to the United States from countries whose tax rates are now way too high. So we, in this room, should do everything possible to help these countries cut their corporate tax rates, not only to be more competitive, but also to drive a wedge between the member states and the European Union and the Oxfams. All right, well, let me finish up with a rant on soda taxes. I don't drink many of these, but man, do I get pissed at taxing them. One of the core principles of economically sound tax policy is the notion of neutrality. And what that means is that taxes should be neutral to both individual and business decision making. Another way of looking at it is that politicians should not use tax policy either as social engineering or as economic planning, or to punish the economy, basically. Now, there are some economists who justify specific types of taxes as a way of preventing our behavior from harming others. And these are called Pigouvian taxes. Everybody heard of Pigouvian taxes? They're named after a British economist from the 1920s, Arthur Pigou, who spent a lifetime studying how they could use tax policy to prevent my behavior from impacting Yassiks. Now, these aren't always the best tax policy, and I kind of get them from a libertarian standpoint. If you're going to tax anything, tax something that's going to harm somebody else, right? Now, soda and snack taxes are different. And to me, these simple little taxes are as big a threat to our liberty as corporate income taxes are to the economy. And the reason that they're such a big threat is that they're justified under the premise of what is best for us. Because some people believe that drinking a soda or having a snack is going to be bad for us. It might make us obese, it might make us unhealthy, and that has social costs. Well, that's because we've socialized medicine, of course. So instead of taxing our behavior to prevent us from harming others, these taxes are for our own good. And I find that really more insidious. All right, thank you. That's much better. Now I sound like I'm on National Public Radio. I find these taxes much more insidious. I find it insulting. It takes away my choice, my free will. It says that others know what's best for me. And I think what's really insidious about it is these product taxes impact every consumer in order to solve the problems of a few. So they're socializing individual problems, such as there is any connection between drinking one of these and your health. And these kind of taxes are getting support from American economists like Larry Summers, who was formerly the Treasury Secretary under Bill Clinton. And he wrote an essay recently titled, "If we want to improve global health, we need to tax the things that are killing us." It's pretty ominous, isn't it? He argues that beyond the direct effects of higher prices and discouraging the consumption of things like tobacco, soda, and alcohol, taxes send a signal of social disapproval. You can just hear his finger wave when he does that. He says, no one wants to be eating dessert after a group restaurant meal. So through social multipliers, higher taxes discourage emulation of risky behavior. Well, if we're going to tax the things that kill us, don't tax soda and snacks. Tax the things that really contribute to our sedentary lives. How about taxing sofas? For all you couch potatoes out there, we're gonna tax it right out from under you. We'll tax televisions. How about remote controls? You have to get up out of your soda to go change the channel like we did when I was a kid. Actually, I was the remote control for my dad. Son, go change the channel. Computer games, office, well, you get where I'm going with all this. So now we've got Pigouvian taxes that are meant to discourage us from behavior that harms others. And I'd like to recommend a new tax, or name for a tax, for the taxes that are meant for our own good. We're going to call them Sumerian taxes, after Larry Summers. And he's working with billionaire Michael Bloomberg, who's funding a lot of these anti-soda initiatives across the globe. He funded the Mexican one, he's funded ones in the United States, etc. And he's given a lot of money to the World Health Organization, who's now putting a huge amount of effort and resources into pushing these kinds of taxes, especially in developing countries, under the guise of stopping, get this, the epidemic of non-communicable diseases, what they call NCDs. Now, you wordsmiths out there, get the connection here. Epidemic, non-communicable, right? Now, these are things like obesity, heart disease, tooth decay, and automobile accidents. Well, maybe we should tax automobiles too. So they're putting as much energy into this as they are to trying to stop Ebola and malaria. And they're warning governments in developing nations against buying into the myths being perpetrated by soda companies against these kind of policies. And believe it or not, the WHO thinks it's a myth that soda taxes are regressive. Yes, under their crazy logic, it is true that the poor will disproportionately pay more of their income in soda taxes than the rich. But the poor will always also be the biggest beneficiary of the government programs that those soda taxes fund. So not only are they better off because they're healthier, because they've gotten all these new government benefits. So you see, they're not regressive after all. These people live in a bubble land of their own making. Well, let me just wrap this up. You know, taxes may not be sexy or even funny, but they do impact our lives in a lot more ways than I think we realize. And in 1927, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who at that time was Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, wrote something that lives on today, unfortunately. He said, "Taxes are the price that we pay for a civilized society." Taxes are the price that we pay for a civilized society. I'm sure you hear variants of that every day. And I have a lot of problems with that phrase, and I think you probably do too. Taxes are not voluntary, no matter how they are paid. They're either extracted from our income, they're added to the price of the things that we buy, or they're paid on the value of the things that we own. There is nothing civilized about forcibly reducing someone's standard of living or their ability to buy what they want when government takes money away from them. There's nothing civilized about using taxes to change people's behavior in order to meet some bureaucrat's notion of what is a healthy lifestyle or what is an environmentally safe automobile. And there's nothing civilized about governments deliberately using taxes to punish disfavored industries. If we're going to have taxes, God help us, then it's up to people like us to make sure that they do the least amount of economic harm as possible and pay only for the limited government that we need. So thank you very much. Enjoy your day. Just a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, we have 9 minutes, so I think 3 to 4 questions. Yes.
Do you have some written message of this? I mean, it's a very interesting presentation, and we as a foundation which deals with education, and our target are young people 18 years old. It could be very good, you know,
sure,
educational material.
I'd be happy to write this up in a more formal way.
Right, so I ask you.
Sure.
Okay,
thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thomas Piketty has been promoting wealth taxes, and France has actually adopted some.
Yeah.
Is this something, Oxfam, is this something we need to be worried about, or will this die out worldwide?
No, the wealth tax issue is a very serious one, and France was just the starter. Other countries are going to move to that direction, and it's all under this notion that somehow the wealthy can move their income around and escape taxation. And I think you do need to take it very, very seriously, because government's they've maxed out what they can collect in value-added taxes. They've maxed out what they can collect in personal income taxes. They've maxed out what they can collect in social insurance taxes. They're looking under every sofa cushion possible to get another dollar. That's why they're chasing companies like this, here and then in here.
Another sofa cushion right now.
Another sofa cushion?
We live in Silicon Valley. The cities there are now taxing any company that has more than 99 employees.
Yeah,
the
head taxes. Yeah, we helped beat back a head tax in Seattle, which was originally going to be $500 per employee. It got whittled back to $250, and it was all to pay for homelessness. And so these big companies, I made a joke on television saying that they're going to have lots of room for homeless when all these companies move out of the office buildings in downtown Seattle. So yeah, be worried about them here and then the next one.
This may be a convoluted argument, but isn't it possible that taxes could actually promote liberty in the ends of, for instance, I'm thinking of decriminalizing marijuana or drugs? Isn't paying some tax on those preferable to what we're seeing in terms of being totally outlawed?
Well, we've certainly seen that in the United States, where more and more states and localities are legalizing marijuana, and really for the tax value. Actually, my colleagues at the Tax Foundation have been working very, very closely with these cities and states, trying to teach them about how to do it in a proper way. Well, I mean, there are bad ways that you can tax things. And so governments, again, they're looking at every penny, every dollar, every euro that they can get, and they're now looking at things like this. And it's finally, I think their greed for more revenues is overtaken any sort of moral qualms they had about that particular product. Yes, sir, in the blue shirt.
When we discuss tax issues, progressives tend to say, talk in terms of people paying their fair share. But I would contend that my fair share is 0. And so I'm a big advocate of tax evasion, or tax fraud. I think it's moral, and in fact maybe a moral imperative that if you have money, it's your moral duty to keep it from the government who will do harm. So I'm wondering what you think about any strategies that people can do to evade taxes, and what we can do politically to give them political cover for that.
Well, there are a few cameras on here, so we'll talk about that in beers at dinner. In the back.
Sorry, point and a question. So the point is, you brought up something really fascinating. I remember reading an article a couple of years back, editorial, I think it was Forbes or something, talking about the importance of, and which was brought up earlier today, think tanks. If you look at the strength of think tanks within the United States, particularly privately funded think tanks, in other words, not government funds going...
Like the tax foundation.
Policy, like the tax
If you
foundation.
want to shelter your income, giving to the tax foundation, you get a tax deduction, so...
It occurs to me that, we talk in the United States, we talk about the fourth pillar of government being the media, but we should be talking about the fifth pillar, which is the great work that's being done by libertarian-oriented think tank groups that are helping to come up with policies and fight back against. Because when governments give money to, for example, Oxfam, and Oxfam creates policy recommendations, it's not independent. And so that's a fascinating thought that I just had. My question was, when can we finally make this connection, and how can we finally wake up the public between entitlements and debt and taxes? I mean, this is the major issue of our day. It's a great evil that we're bestowing upon our children. And how can we make that issue?
As long as governments can always put off the cost of what the government we're getting, it's called fiscal illusion, and that government looks cheaper because much of it is debt financed rather than actually taxed. And so these taxes then come due on our kids. I don't know. I think trying to break that fiscal illusion is the key. I don't know if I have a great strategy. I wrote an article on this a number of years ago, and God help me, I can't remember what I said, but it must have been brilliant, and I'll get back to you on that one. Jim? Jim?
First of all, Scott, thank you again for all the great work that you've been doing for all of these many years. For those of you who don't know what Mr. Hodge has been doing, he's been doing the work of the Lord for many years, and I think we all owe him a great round of applause. On what I see as a very insidious second prong of this approach, and essentially you mentioned Larry Summers, the war on cash, the extent to which people are trying to move us into a cashless society, which of course would facilitate greatly the collection of taxes.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and you're fighting against the tide too of the millennials and others who, I bet most of them don't even carry cash anymore, because you can pay with a credit card or a debit card in a heartbeat, or hell, I can pay on my watch. And so my connection to cash is becoming pretty limited. I don't know how you reverse that trend, because technology is making it so easy. I can bank online. I can, I'm doing everything on this. I can deposit. I can, move money around. I can invest. I wish I had an answer for that, but I do like to carry cash. It makes me feel important. Yes, sir.
Where would I look for about all these different taxes? So if I were to start a company, where would I look for to know what taxes and how I roll these attack groups? So it's a bureaucrat when they just come along and say, oh, you didn't pay that because I didn't know about it.
A good starter is to come to the Tax Foundation website, taxfoundation.org, and look up a really fine publication we do every year called the International Tax Competitiveness Index. A wonderfully catchy title, which I made up because it's so descriptive. And we rank all the OECD countries in terms of how good or simple or competitive their tax systems are. And you can go in there, and Poland ranks very poorly, by the way. Poland ranks 31st out of 35 countries in terms of the competitiveness or the business friendliness of its tax system. But don't feel bad, the United States ranks 30th.
Last question.
So we are only one spot away from you. One last question.
Yes, you are putting emphasis on taxation, but there are different other ways of wealth redistribution, such as creating money out of thin air, such as inflation. And they say that if taxation is even taken away, if there are no taxes, they still can control you totally.
Sure.
So what do you think about other ways of redistribution?
You got to be eternally vigilant against all of these threats, and whether it's regulatory threats, monetary threats like our friend, the diligent person here in the back, or taxation. Be eternally vigilant. We did a study, taxes go to pay for things. We kind of forget that. They take our taxes and then they spend it. And we did a calculation a few years ago looking at the total amount of redistribution through both tax and spending policy in the United States. And we found out that the U.S. government is transferring or redistributing $1.5 trillion a year from the top 40% of Americans to the bottom 60%. Now, what's unique about that ratio? It means that more than half of all Americans are getting more back from government, or shall I say more specifically, more is being spent on them than they are paying in taxes. I think we're past the tipping point, and it's a real danger. And I don't know how to put the genie back in the bottle or the horse back in the barn or whatever other metaphor, but you just got to be eternally vigilant, and it's up to each and every one of us. That's why we are here in this room. To be vigilant, to have our principles intact, and to be able to argue these things forcibly, not only so that we can win the trust of our neighbors, but obviously the people who vote for these things, and to try to get the right people in there so that we can stop it from within. And with that, we are out of time.
Yeah.
No, it's time for dinner!